one of the interesting features of the school commentaries of the late 12th century was that they show a remarkable effort at synthesizing and compiling the entire literature of the Fathers, the entire commentatorial tradition of the Fathers. The commentary of the Middle Ages was nothing if not traditional. Everyone knew that the Fathers' commentaries had to be taken stock of. They were authoritative in the very, very strong sense of the word. This isn't to say that every father had equal weight for every book of the Bible. Each book, as some of you may have guessed, had its own commentatorial tradition. So, for example, if we're thinking of the book of Job, of course, the big figure there is Gregory the Great. If we're looking at the Psalms, we're thinking of Augustine. And after Augustine, just about everybody who commented on the Psalms took him as their primary source and compiled not only Augustine, but the commentators on Augustine and so forth. And the same can be said of the commentary on John's Gospel. For many other works, for example, for the Pauline epistles, the big figure is whom? St. Jerome. Now, anyone who's looked at Augustine's commentary on the Psalms, or his exposition of John's Gospel, or Gregory's commentary on Job, his Moralia in Job, which was a capital text throughout the Middle Ages, will know that these are wonderful texts for themselves as literature. They're captivating, and they can be read cover to cover without becoming boring. But one thing they're not well suited to is classroom instruction. If you're trying to teach something about the book of Job, or if you're trying to prepare preachers, Gregory's Moralia, as it stands as a text, doesn't quite work. It has to be compiled or reconfigured. And so basically what happened in the 12th century was the schoolmasters went about cutting and pasting with all of this literature, cutting the little flowers from the nuggets, the really choice remarks from all of these commentaries, and they excerpted them from the original text and planted them in other texts right next to the biblical text to which they belonged. There were many such efforts, but the one that became most famous, the one which most people nowadays talk about, and the one that was cited in the 13th century was the Glossa Ordinaria, where if you take a look at one of the manuscripts or even of the printed edition, which we have in our library, the Rush edition, what you find is the biblical text commented on in the center of the page in very, very large characters. And then you'll have remarks interspersed between the lines of the biblical text. And then you'll have other remarks, lengthier remarks, on the sides, on the margins. The upper margin, the left, the right margin, and the lower margins. So the biblical text is literally surrounded and impregnated with all of these excerpts from various fathers. Some of the fathers are named explicitly, some of them aren't. Usually Augustine is named explicitly. A very substantial number of these glossae are anonymous, and they very likely were added or supplied by the schoolmen of the 12th century. Now, there were many such projects. The famous one that we've just mentioned, the Glossa Ordinaria, was begun at the School of Laon towards the end of the 11th century and the very beginning of the 12th. Anselm of Laon and a few of his other brothers endeavored to supply a line-by-line commentary on the entire Bible from beginning to end, from the Genesis 1:1 to the end of the Apocalypse. They didn't get through the whole of it, but they got through most of it. It's absolutely remarkable how much they accomplished. And by the second quarter of the 12th century, other schools and other members of the School of Laon finished the job, and by about the middle of the 12th century, that is to say about 1150, a standard text of the Glossa Ordinaria had arrived at the schools in Paris. It's often been supposed that the Glossa Ordinaria and the Glossa Marginalia were two different works. Today, even now, some people talk about them as two different works. They were in fact one work. There are no books. There's no evidence to suggest that there was ever a glossa containing the marginal notes and another containing the interlinear notes, and they were both merged at some later date. And in fact, the earlier manuscripts show that there was quite a bit of fluidity between the glossae, which were interlinear, and that is to say between the lines, and the ones that were marginal. In other words, what might be a marginal note in one manuscript would be an interlinear note in another work. So we're basically talking about one work. There's been some discussion about the stability of the text. It's often been supposed that the text was very stable from about the second quarter of the 12th century through the end of the 13th century. It would seem that there was quite a bit of movement in the text and development until the late 12th century. By the time we arrive at the 13th century, it seems to have stabilized a bit. We don't know for certain because most of these manuscripts have not been examined. There are thousands of them surviving, many thousands of them, and we have no critical edition of the Glossa Ordinaria. So what we know about it derives from the study of particular manuscripts in a haphazard fashion. But what this shows is that in the 12th century, the Bible was studied for the purpose of preaching more than for the edification of monks. And this was done with a view towards making use of the entire commentatorial tradition of the Latin West for any particular book. Towards the end of the 12th century, especially at Paris, there emerged a certain way of interpreting the Bible, which came to be known as the biblical moral school. Now, here school is used in a very, very loose manner. It doesn't indicate any sort of institution. It indicates in a very broad sense a tendency or a way of thought. But basically, the biblical moral school is a way of reading the Bible so that the sense that's brought to the fore is the moral sense, either the literal sense read morally or the tropological sense, which is an allegorical sense moralized. Now, if you read the commentaries, those few that have been edited, of people such as Peter the Chanter, Peter Commonster, or Stephen Langton, you'll see that the main purpose is the exhortation of people, lay people, but also friars. Friars didn't exist yet, but secular clergy and so forth. In other words, every text of the Bible was read as a moral lesson. Now, this is wonderful. It makes for easy preaching and good preaching, but as you might suppose, and as you will see if you read these commentaries, this tendency, or this moralization of the Bible, tended to homogenize the biblical text. And so one might have the impression that there's not all that much difference between the prophet Isaiah and, say, the Acts of the Apostles. Which brings us to another hallmark of school exegesis. It was nothing if not intertextual. One of the things that you'll find in these commentaries, you'll see it in 13th century commentary, is the endless ransacking of other biblical texts in the exposition of any given text. So, for example, someone who's commenting on Isaiah 6:1 will cite Habakkuk, will cite Genesis, will cite Leviticus, will cite John's Gospel or Mark's Gospel. And this is all wonderful, but it has a tendency to homogenize the biblical text. Now, in the 13th century, just at the beginning of the 13th century, the last figure of the biblical moral school, Stephen Langton, saw the need for the evangelization of Europe. And he wrote and talked about the need for an Ordo Praedicatorum, an order of preachers. He didn't have in mind a religious order. He had in mind a movement of preachers, well-formed preachers who understood the biblical text and who knew how to preach it. And for this reason, he commented on most of the books of the Bible, taking stock not only of patristic interpretations, but also the interpretations of the masters of the 12th century. They're wonderful commentaries. Not many of them have been printed. Now, this brings us to the Friars, most especially the Dominicans. Most of the literature produced by the Dominicans of the 13th century comes in the form of biblical commentary. And in the beginning of the 13th century, needless to say, most commentators were not Dominicans and they weren't Franciscans. By the time we arrive at the mid-13th century, that is to say about 1250, virtually all the biblical commentaries are by Franciscans or Dominicans. They owned it. Whether that's a desirable development or not is another question, but that was the state of the situation for a few generations, perhaps the second half of the 13th century. Now, what's interesting about Stephen Langton's conception of the Ordo Praedicatorum is that following the methodology of the school, or his basic program was as follows. As we know in the schools, there was an understanding that the biblical text was to be read. There was a certain lectio, which would give rise to a meditatio, which would in turn give rise to a contemplatio. Well, all of this language appears in the works of the school commentators. Hugh of St. Victor, for example, Andrew of St. Victor, they all talk about commenting the Bible or reading the Bible in this way. Stephen Langton talks about a lectio, which gives rise to a disputatio. First, a lectio, perhaps a certain meditatio, but what he mentions explicitly is the lectio, the reading of the biblical text, which gives rise to a disputatio. And from the disputatio would come the predicatio, the preaching. Lectio, disputatio, predicatio. And this is basically what we see the friars doing, reading the Bible, commenting on it, disputing it, asking questions about it. You'll see questions interspersed in all of these biblical commentaries, normally for the sake of reconciling apparent contradictions within the biblical text itself and also within various authoritative comments on the biblical text. If we take a look at these commentaries and this literature, one of the things that we'll see is perhaps the most important feature of Dominican form of life or forms of life. But certainly this form of life was nothing if not biblical. The Dominicans had as their purpose the preaching of the gospel. And all of these commentaries are ordered towards the formation of friars for that purpose. And so unlike the monastic commentaries, the commentaries of someone such as an Aelred or a Bernard, which normally approach the text pericope by pericope, that is to say, passage by passage. These texts would approach it line by line. And so if we take, for example, the narrative of the Good Shepherd in John's Gospel, or if we turn to Luke's Gospel, the prodigal son. Whereas a monastic commentator or a patristic commentator would approach the text as it stands as a pericope, as the narrative of the prodigal son. A scholastic commentator will approach it line by line by line and parse it line by line. Now, we might have the impression, or we might suppose, that this has the tendency to fragment the text and to distort it. That was a weakness of this method in the hands of its less able practitioners. But before we arrive at this line-by-line commentary, we find a feature of university exegesis, which is particularly difficult for modern eyes to penetrate. And this is the feature that we've come across in just about any work of a Dominican or a Franciscan or anybody of the 13th century. It's the divisio textus. It's a hallmark of the university genre, as distinct from scholastic exegesis. But basically, with the divisio textus, we have an approach to the text which organizes the text not according to any sort of preconceived plan and not according to the conception of Augustine or Jerome or anybody of that sort, but according to the conception or the program of the interpreter. In other words, it's there more than anywhere else that we can find the interpreter contributing something to the commentatorial tradition. So he'll divide the text and tell us what it's about and what its purpose is, and then he'll subdivide it and subdivide it and subdivide it. But the divisio textus serves many purposes. One of them is that it provides a system of cross-reference to the text and a system of organizing the text in a time when there was no pagination.